Have you ever wondered why it feels like the moment you finally decide to walk away, everything inside them starts to shift? Even if they never said a word. Not loudly, not openly, but something changes in the silence. Something invisible, yet powerful. And strangely enough, it is not your presence that creates the impact anymore. It is your absence. This is where most people misunderstand avoidant individuals. They assume distance means indifference. They assume silence means they do not care. They assume emotional withdrawal is a sign of strength, control, or even superiority. But psychology tells a very different story. Behind that calm exterior, behind that emotional detachment, there is a deeply protected internal world that is far more sensitive than it appears. Avoidant personalities are not built from lack of emotion. They are built from overprotection of emotion. At some point in their life, closeness became uncomfortable, maybe even painful. So instead of learning how to process emotional intensity, they learned how to escape it. They learned that staying distant feels safer than staying connected. They learned that needing less means getting hurt less, and over time this turned into identity. I don't need anyone. I'm fine on my own. I don't get attached. But what looks like independence is often a carefully constructed emotional defense system. And like all defense systems, it only works as long as nothing challenges it. That is where walking away becomes something they were never emotionally prepared for. Because when you are available, when you are emotionally present, when you are trying, when you are showing consistency, their system stays stable. Even if they don't fully express it, even if they don't fully respond, your presence still creates a predictable emotional environment for them. And predictability is what keeps their internal world calm. But the moment you start pulling away, something subtle begins to happen. Not immediately, not dramatically, but internally. Your attention, which they quietly adjusted to, starts disappearing. Your emotional availability, which they didn't fully acknowledge but still relied on, starts fading. And suddenly, the emotional environment they were used to managing without effort changes. And this change is not just external, it is psychological. Because avoidant individuals are not just reacting to you, they are reacting to what your absence triggers inside them. And what it triggers is not always comfort. Sometimes it is confusion. Sometimes it is discomfort. And sometimes it is a quiet disruption of their internal balance. This is where the ego begins to enter the picture. Not ego in the sense of arrogance alone, but ego as a protective identity. The part of them that says, I am okay without this. I don't feel anything. I don't need to react. It is a shield, a way to maintain emotional distance from their own emotional response. But human psychology has a pattern. What we suppress does not disappear. It waits. It lingers. It shows up in indirect ways. So when someone walks away from an avoidant person, what seems like a simple act of distance becomes something more powerful. It becomes a mirror, a silent interruption, a break in emotional routine. And the mind does not always like breaks it cannot explain, because deep down, even avoidant individuals are wired for connection. Not dependency, but connection. Not emotional chaos, but emotional meaning. And when that meaning suddenly disappears, it creates a gap, a space where silence becomes louder than expected. This is why walking away is not just about leaving someone behind. It is about shifting the emotional structure they were quietly leaning on without admitting it. It is about removing the predictability that kept their ego stable. And when stability is disrupted even slightly, the mind starts to pay attention. Now here is where things become even more interesting. Most people never realize this part. They think the impact of walking away is immediate. But in reality, the strongest reactions are often delayed. They don't appear in words. They appear in thoughts, in reflection, in subtle emotional tension that cannot be easily explained or ignored. And if you understand this deeply, you start to see something powerful. Walking away is not about punishment. It is not about proving a point. It is not even about getting a reaction. It is about self-respect meeting psychological reality. It is about understanding that presence only has value where it is recognized. If you stay until you are emotionally drained, you reinforce imbalance. But when you leave at the right moment, you reset the emotional dynamic completely. And whether they show it or not, the absence creates an impact their ego was never designed to ignore forever. And if you keep watching till the end, you will understand exactly how this silent shift breaks through even the strongest avoidant defenses, and why sometimes your absence speaks louder to them than anything you ever said when you were still there. The avoidant mindset is often misunderstood, especially by people who experience their emotional distance personally. From the outside, it can look cold, careless, or even intentional, but when you go deeper into psychological patterns, a very different picture starts to form. It is not about a lack of emotion. It is about how emotion was once handled in a way that felt overwhelming, unsafe, or uncontrollable. At the core of this mindset is a strong internal rule. If I depend too much, I will lose control of myself. This belief does not appear overnight. It is shaped over time through experiences where closeness may have felt unpredictable, where emotional needs were not consistently met, or where vulnerability led to disappointment. So instead of learning to lean in, the mind learns to step back. Instead of expressing needs, it learns to minimize them. Instead of building emotional reliance, it builds emotional distance as protection. This is why avoidant individuals often appear self-sufficient. They develop a psychological habit of relying on themselves for emotional regulation. They convince themselves that independence is not just a choice, but a necessity for stability. And over time, this belief becomes so deeply embedded that it feels like truth rather than conditioning. But beneath this structure, there is a quieter layer that most people never see. It is the internal tension between wanting connection and fearing the consequences of it. This conflict does not always show externally. Instead, it operates internally as emotional resistance. When someone gets too close, the system reacts by pulling away. Not because connection is unwanted, but because closeness triggers a sense of vulnerability that feels difficult to manage. This is where emotional contradiction begins. On one side, there is curiosity, attraction, or even attachment. On the other side, there is discomfort, hesitation, and the urge to regain distance. These two forces do not cancel each other out. They coexist. And this coexistence creates confusion not only for others, but for the avoidant person themselves. What makes this pattern even more complex is that it is often automatic. It is not a conscious decision to push people away. It is a reflex developed by the nervous system. When emotional intensity rises, the brain activates protective responses. Distance becomes a form of emotional regulation. Silence becomes a way to reset internal balance. Detachment becomes a method of staying in control. Because control is the central theme here. Not control over others, but control over emotional exposure. The avoidant mind is constantly scanning for signs of emotional dependency, not because it is unwanted, but because it feels risky. Dependency is associated with unpredictability, and unpredictability is interpreted as emotional danger. So instead of engaging deeply, the system chooses to limit emotional investment. This is also why they often appear composed during emotional situations. It is not that they are unaffected. It is that they are trained to suppress visible reactions. Expressing too much feels unsafe. Showing too much feels exposing. So they learn to internalize instead of externalize. But internalization does not eliminate emotion. It stores it. And stored emotion does not disappear. It influences behavior in indirect ways. It can show up as withdrawal, delayed responses, sudden detachment, or even emotional inconsistency. These behaviors are not random. They are protective responses designed to maintain psychological safety. Another important aspect of this mindset is the belief in emotional self-reliance. Many avoidant individuals develop a strong identity around not needing others. This identity becomes a source of pride. It reinforces the idea that independence equals strength. But beneath that pride, there is often an unspoken sensitivity to emotional disruption. Because when someone becomes emotionally significant, they also become a potential source of emotional influence. And influence threatens control. This is why closeness often feels uncomfortable even when it is desired. The mind associates closeness with responsibility, expectation, and potential emotional dependency. So instead of moving toward it fully, there is hesitation. A step forward, followed by a step back. A moment of engagement, followed by withdrawal. This push and pull pattern is not confusion alone. It is regulation. But here is where things become deeply important to understand. Avoidance is not just about avoiding people, it is about avoiding emotional overwhelm. It is about maintaining a sense of internal stability in a world where emotional intensity can feel destabilizing, so distance becomes a strategy, not a personality flaw. A coping mechanism, not a lack of feeling. However, coping mechanisms always come with trade-offs. While distance provides temporary safety, it also limits emotional depth. While detachment reduces vulnerability, it also reduces connection. And over time, this creates an internal gap that is rarely addressed directly. Instead, it is managed through continued avoidance. This is why interactions with avoidant individuals often feel inconsistent. Not because they are unaware, but because their internal system is constantly balancing two opposing needs: the need for connection and the need for protection. And depending on which need feels more threatened at the moment, their behavior shifts. Understanding this pattern changes everything. It removes the illusion of emotional simplicity and replaces it with psychological depth. It reveals that what looks like distance is often a carefully maintained equilibrium, and what looks like disinterest may actually be controlled engagement. When this understanding is clear, the idea of walking away gains a different meaning. It is no longer just a reaction to behavior. It becomes a shift in emotional structure. Because when someone who is used to managing distance encounters complete absence, the system they rely on for balance is disrupted. And that disruption is where deeper reactions begin to form, often quietly, often internally, and often in ways that are not immediately visible. When emotional attachment begins to form, something subtle starts happening inside an avoidance system that most people completely miss. It is not a sudden change, and it is not something they openly recognize. It is a gradual internal pressure that builds as emotional closeness increases. What once felt light and manageable slowly starts to feel more demanding, more noticeable, and more psychologically active. This shift does not come from the other person doing something wrong. It comes from proximity itself. When emotional presence becomes consistent, the brain begins to register importance. And importance in this mindset is often linked with responsibility. The more someone matters, the more emotional weight is attached to the interaction. And that weight is what creates tension. At first, this tension is barely noticeable. There may still be engagement, still interaction, still moments of warmth, but internally, the system starts tracking emotional exposure. It starts measuring how much is being felt, how much is being expected, and how much is being revealed. This quiet evaluation creates a subtle sense of pressure that builds over time. As this pressure grows, emotional responses begin to shift. Communication may become less frequent, responses may become shorter, presence may become inconsistent, not because interest disappears, but because the internal system starts prioritizing emotional balance over emotional depth. The goal is no longer connection, the goal becomes stability. This is where emotional distance begins to form in a more noticeable way. It is not always a conscious decision, it is often a reaction to internal overload. When emotional intensity crosses a certain threshold, the mind instinctively creates space. That space is not meant to hurt anyone. It is meant to reduce internal discomfort. However, this space has consequences. While it provides relief internally, it creates confusion externally. The other person experiences the shift as sudden or unexpected. But from the avoidant perspective, it is usually the result of gradual accumulation rather than a single event. Inside this process, another important psychological mechanism appears: emotional self-protection through minimization. The mind begins to downplay emotional significance to reduce internal pressure. Thoughts like, "this is not that important," or "I don't need this much connection," are not necessarily truth statements. They are regulation strategies. They help reduce emotional intensity by reducing perceived importance. But even while these thoughts exist, emotional attachment does not simply disappear. It remains active underneath the surface. This creates internal inconsistency. On one level, there is detachment. On another level, there is awareness of attachment, and this dual experience creates internal friction that is not easily resolved. This friction often leads to avoidance behaviors becoming stronger. Not because emotion is absent, but because emotion feels harder to manage. The more something is felt, the more distance is used to stabilize it. This is why patterns can seem repetitive: approach, retreat, silence, re-engagement. It is not randomness, it is regulation under emotional pressure. At this stage, ego begins to play a stronger role, not as pride in the traditional sense, but as psychological preservation. The internal narrative shifts toward maintaining emotional independence. The mind reinforces identity statements that support distance. I am better alone. I don't get affected. I stay in control. These are not always beliefs held with full certainty. They are stabilizing thoughts used to reduce emotional vulnerability. But beneath these stabilizing thoughts, emotional imprint remains, and emotional imprint is what becomes important when change happens in the environment. When someone who was emotionally present begins to withdraw, the system experiences a disruption in expectation. The mind had adjusted to a certain level of availability, even if that availability was not fully acknowledged. And when that pattern changes, it creates cognitive dissonance. Something expected is no longer happening, and the brain begins to register that absence as meaningful. This is where internal processing becomes more active. Thoughts increase, reflection increases. Emotional neutrality becomes harder to maintain consistently, not because the absence is overwhelming, but because it interrupts a familiar emotional rhythm. What makes this even more complex is that avoidant systems often rely on delayed emotional awareness. Feelings are not always processed in real time. Instead, they surface later, when external stimulation decreases. So while the initial response to distance may appear calm or unaffected, internal processing continues in the background. Over time, the absence of emotional input becomes noticeable, not in a dramatic way, but in a reflective way. The mind begins to revisit interactions, moments, and patterns. It starts evaluating what changed and why. This evaluation is not always conscious. It often appears as subtle thoughts that arise during quiet moments. At the same time, ego resistance may still be active. The system may try to maintain the idea of unaffectedness, but when emotional patterns are disrupted for long enough, resistance weakens. Not immediately, not visibly, but internally. This is where emotional realization begins to form. Not necessarily realization of loss in a dramatic sense, but realization of change. Something that was once stable is no longer stable. Something that was once predictable is now uncertain. And uncertainty forces attention. Attention is the key element here. Because what the avoidance system previously filtered out through emotional distance now becomes more noticeable through absence. When presence is removed, contrast becomes visible. And contrast is what activates awareness. At this point, the internal system is no longer just regulating emotion. It is processing meaning, and meaning creates weight. It creates reflection that cannot be fully dismissed. This is the stage where walking away reveals its deeper psychological effect, not through confrontation, not through explanation, but through interruption of emotional equilibrium. The absence becomes a signal that something has changed in the structure they were quietly adapted to, and that signal cannot be completely ignored, even if it is not immediately expressed. When emotional distance becomes noticeable from the other side, the avoidance system does not immediately respond with clarity or expression. Instead, it enters a phase of internal processing that is often quiet, fragmented, and layered with contradiction. On the surface, nothing may seem different. Daily functioning continues, normal behavior continues. But internally, something has already shifted into motion. This shift is not about sudden realization, it is about delayed awareness. The mind starts registering the change in availability, but it does not instantly assign emotional meaning to it. Instead, it observes first. It gathers signals. It compares current interaction patterns with previous ones, and through this comparison, it begins to detect inconsistency. Inconsistency is important because it interrupts familiarity. The avoidance system is highly sensitive to emotional patterns, even if it does not openly express that sensitivity. When a pattern changes, especially one that involved emotional stability or consistent presence, the mind does not dismiss it easily. It stores it. It replays fragments of interaction. It tries to locate the point of shift. During this phase, emotional response remains controlled, but cognitive activity increases. Thoughts become more frequent, not necessarily emotional at first, but analytical. Questions begin to surface internally, not spoken questions, but reflective ones. What changed? Why did it change? Was it expected? Was it avoidable? These internal questions do not always lead to immediate emotional expression. Instead, they create a background level of psychological engagement. The mind becomes occupied with reconstruction of emotional timeline. It starts mapping the transition from presence to absence, trying to understand the sequence of events. At the same time, another internal process begins to activate. It is the comparison between expectation and reality. Expectation is based on past familiarity, the assumption that interaction would continue in a certain form. Reality introduces a deviation from that assumption. And when expectation and reality do not align, internal tension emerges. This tension is not always recognized as emotional discomfort. It may appear as restlessness, distraction, or even increased mental activity. But underneath those surface experiences, there is a subtle form of emotional activation taking place. The system is adjusting to loss of predictability. Predictability plays a crucial role in emotional regulation for avoidant individuals. Even when they resist closeness, they still rely on emotional patterns being somewhat stable. Stability does not require intensity. It only requires consistency. When that consistency is removed, the internal system has to recalibrate. Recalibration is not immediate. It happens in phases. First comes observation, then comparison, then reflection, and only after these stages does emotional interpretation begin to form more clearly. During reflection, memory becomes active in a different way. It is no longer just recalling events. It is reevaluating emotional significance attached to those events. Moments that were previously dismissed or minimized can start to gain new weight. Conversations may be replayed with different interpretation. Silence may be re-examined with different meaning. This shift in interpretation is where emotional awareness starts to deepen. But even here, expression is not guaranteed. Avoidant systems are built around internal processing rather than external release. So what is felt does not always translate into visible reaction. Instead, it remains contained, often processed privately. At the same time, internal resistance may still exist. The part of the mind that maintains independence as identity may attempt to reduce the importance of what is being felt. It may introduce rational explanations. It may suggest that nothing significant has changed. It may attempt to restore emotional neutrality through logic. This creates a dual-layer experience. One layer is processing change. The other layer is resisting interpretation of change. These two layers operate simultaneously, creating internal complexity that is not easily resolved in a single direction. Over time, however, repeated absence of emotional input weakens resistance. The mind begins to adjust not through acceptance, but through adaptation. It learns to function with reduced emotional feedback. And in doing so, it becomes more aware of what is missing. This awareness is subtle at first. It may appear as periodic thoughts rather than continuous reflection. Certain triggers, certain memories, certain quiet moments may activate awareness of absence, and each activation reinforces the significance of change. As this process continues, emotional recognition becomes more defined. Not in an explosive way, but in a gradual accumulation of understanding. The system begins to recognize that what was once part of emotional routine is no longer present, and that recognition carries psychological weight. What makes this stage particularly important is that it marks transition from external detachment to internal acknowledgement. Even if outward behavior remains unchanged, internal perception has already shifted. The mind is no longer in original state of neutrality. It is now processing difference. Difference creates awareness. Awareness creates reflection. And reflection, over time, creates emotional imprint. This imprint does not always lead to immediate behavioral change. Instead, it influences future responses. It alters how similar situations are interpreted. It shapes how emotional availability is perceived moving forward. And it leaves a subtle trace in the psychological structure of attachment and distance. At this point, walking away has already achieved its deeper effect, not through confrontation or reaction, but through interruption of emotional continuity. It has created space where automatic patterns no longer function the same way. It has introduced absence where presence was previously assumed. And in that absence, the mind is forced to engage in a level of processing that was previously avoided through consistency. What remains is not just memory of interaction, but awareness of change. And that awareness continues to influence internal dynamics long after external contact has ended.